In my two previous videos on this subject, I explained how the modern deep state globalist elite was formed and commandeered the British visible state apparatus, followed by that of the United States of America. In this episode, I will be discussing how this deep state cabal orchestrated and engineered the First World War, and why. By 1900, the British Empire was at its peak. The empire stretched over an area of approximately 25% of the Earth's landmass, which was inhabited by over 400 million people. This gave Britain unlimited access to vast amounts of almost every natural resource known to man at this time. As a result, Britain was able to build up a very large industrial base, making Britain the leader in mass production of not only consumer goods, but munitions and weapons of war, which yielded enormous profits. Britain was able to hold and maintain control over its vast empire with the might of the Royal Navy, which was the undisputed ruler of the oceans, allowing for control over all the sea lanes and choke points connecting Europe to the Far East. Subsequently, all the trade routes fell under British control, as there were no land bridges linking Europe to the Far East, as the case was many centuries previous, when the Silk Road was still open. With strategic territories such as the Suez and Gibraltar under British rule, there was no way of bypassing British influence on global trade. Together with the City of London as the financial capital of the world, Britain was the global hegemon. The United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy with a representative government where the people are ruled by consent, or so we are told. The truth is, Britain is in fact a plutocracy where the levers of power are controlled by private, unknown, and unaccountable individuals. Behind the British visible state, in Westminster, whom everyone could see in Parliament, existed a shadowy clique of very wealthy bankers and industrialists. They were not unknown per se, as these people lived and conducted their business as part of the British nation, and many held positions in government, some of whom were very well known, such as Cecil Rhodes, effectively hiding in plain sight. However, behind closed doors, they conspired and made decisions that would affect not only the British people, but the entire world. These individuals formed a secret elite cabal, which was initially headed by Cecil Rhodes when he founded the Round Table Group in 1891. This secret society has been known at various times as Milner's Kindergarten, the Milner Group, the Rhodes Crowd, the All Souls Group, the Chatham House Crowd, the Cliveden Set, and other unofficial names, all referring to the same organization, which had no formal entry initiation procedures, passwords, or ceremonies. All members knew each other, many were close friends, and thus shared the same aims and ambitions of consolidating the British Empire for the purpose of expanding and ultimately bringing the entire world under their control. In order to achieve this, they needed to remove competing power blocks which stood in their way. During this time, there were 10 main players on the global chessboard: Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Turkey, the USA, Russia, China, and Japan. Most of these nations and empires had formed treaties and alliances, resulting in 4 distinct power blocks. These being the Western Atlanticists, that is, France and Britain, the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Turkey, the Russian Empire, and the Empire of Japan. This was around the year 1900, and although Italy ended up siding with the Atlanticists in 1915, they were originally an ally of Germany and Austria. Russia was its own power bloc, but had made a formal alliance with France, and by extension, Britain, also known as the Triple Entente. The Central Powers had organized their own mutual defense treaty known as the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, and Italy. This resulted in the Central Powers being surrounded by their enemies, meaning if hostilities began, they would be faced with a war on two fronts, something they wished to avoid at all costs. By 1905, the secret elite, which I will refer to as the Milner Group, had identified their main adversary, Germany, and by extension, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. Germany, however, was by far the most powerful. It held significant overseas colonies, had a very advanced infrastructure, a large population, a very capable labor force, a powerful industry which had overtaken Britain, and was building up a large fleet of battleships, rivaling the Royal Navy. If the British were to take over and create a one-world empire, Germany had to be defeated militarily. With each year passing, Germany was only becoming stronger. The Milner Group understood that even with the combined forces of Britain and France, this would be insufficient for defeating Germany and Austria. They needed Russia on their side. Germany had a standing army that was very large and very well trained. They had an advanced railway network, allowing for quick deployment of troops anywhere on the front. The idea was to wear Germany down in a grinding war of attrition, while at the same time putting in place a naval blockade, cutting off access to its colonies, and thus depriving the Germans of raw materials only available outside of Europe. Despite its powerful navy, which included submarines, or U-boats, Germany would not be able to break this blockade, and instead relied on raw materials sourced inside Europe, such as iron ore from Sweden. Many other materials were replaced with synthetic alternatives, making Germany self-sufficient and able to maintain its war efforts. The Milner Group calculated that Germany would run out of resources and struggle to feed its population given enough time. However, this would require full commitment from France and Russia, and pressure must be applied relentlessly in order to force Germany into negotiations. British power alone could never hope to defeat Germany. Being a naval power, any aspirations of winning a major land war were impossible, due to the lack of a large standing army. Britain was only equipped for limited land battles, invading and fighting native peoples in the global south, many of whom barely had any firearms. This was a completely different war game and required a coalition, much like 100 years previous against Napoleonic France. So how could the Milner Group not only convince foreign powers, some of which they'd been at war with barely 50 years prior, but also their own population and government to start a war against the Central Powers? This was by no means an easy task, and demanded careful planning and serious skill. France had been utterly defeated and humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, radically changing the balance of power on the continent, leaving a contingent in the French political establishment with a bitter resentment towards Germany, wishing for revenge, also known as revanchists. The Milner Group sought to capitalize on this, and using their vast slush fund, were able to promote revanchism by bribing the French press, which would help warmongering politicians get elected, thus steering France in the desired direction. Individuals such as Raymond Poincaré, Théophile Delcassé, and Paul Cambon. France and Russia had already formed a mutual defense agreement known as the Dual Entente. This Franco-Russian alliance meant that each side would come to each other's aid in the event of a war with Germany. This was crucial for the Milner Group, which absolutely had to ensure this alliance remained in place. The Milner Group were also active in Russian politics. It was absolutely essential that Russia join as a co-belligerent in their war against Germany, and by extension Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. King Edward had spoken to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas, in favor of Alexander Izvolsky, the Russian foreign minister, and later ambassador to France. Izvolsky, whom he had befriended in Denmark in 1905, lived a lavish lifestyle beyond his means, supported by funds from the Milner Group. Izvolsky's animosity towards Austria-Hungary, which nearly derailed his career in 1908, led him to incite Balkan countries against the Austrian Empire. With regular financial support, he was promised that in the event of a successful war with Germany, Constantinople would be annexed to Russia, giving them control of the Bosphorus Straits. An effective yet empty promise, as plans to carve up the Ottoman Empire did not include Russia. Allowing Constantinople to fall under Russian control was politically impossible for London. Nonetheless, Izvolsky believed his paymasters, remaining loyal to them, and continued to promote their cause. Together, Delcasse, Poincaré, and Izvolsky were key figures in the lead-up to war, and their influence over the Russian and French mobilizations in 1914 was crucial. All three owed their positions to the Milner Group, whose slush funds were made available to buy public opinion through the press. Lighting the fire. Starting a war is no easy task, and a prior attempt was made but failed to ignite the conflict the Milner Group was seeking with Germany. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 were supposed to provoke a military response from Austria-Hungary. However, the Kaiser of Germany managed to restrain the dual monarchy from taking the bait from Serbia's antagonism. Serbia had been identified as the key to instigating hostilities. Given Germany's astute leadership and lack of potential instability along its borders, it was impossible to start a war directly with Berlin. The Balkans, however, was a plethora of various ethnic groups and religions that had endured occupation and rule from the major powers, and was often the flashpoint and conflict zone where these powers collided, resulting in a somewhat unstable region, as history has shown, even to this day. With the Ottoman Empire in slow decline over the previous centuries, new states emerged in the region. As the empire retracted, losing territory, and by the early 1900s, all but Thrace had been lost. Serbia was on Austria-Hungary's southern border and presented an opportunity for the Milner Group. The dual monarchy was aware of the interference of Serbia's internal politics by the Russian ambassador Nikolai Hartwig in Belgrade, who had been manipulating the Serbian government. Their military intelligence had intercepted a large number of diplomatic telegrams that detailed Russian involvement with several activist groups within Serbia. They knew of Hartwig's links back to the Russian foreign minister, Sassanov, in St. Petersburg, and to the Paris-based warmongers, Izvolsky and Poincaré. But like everyone else, they were not aware of the real power centered in London, which was pulling the strings. The Serbian government had been compromised by a quasi-independent society known as the Black Hand. Described as Masonic in self-promotion, a mafia-style society which had infiltrated the military, the police, the civil service, and the government. With its own newspaper, the Piedmont, it spread a message of intolerance towards Austria-Hungary. The existence of the Black Hand, which had effectively become a government within a government, created a dangerous situation, operating in the shadows with no accountability, crimes were committed for which no one took responsibility, and the government denied any knowledge of it. Nikolai Hartwig worked closely with the Russian military attaché Artamanov, who was posted to Belgrade to liaise with the Serbian army, which had been infiltrated by the Black Hand, whose founder, Colonel Dragutin Dimitrovic, also known as Apis, an imposing figure, had become the most influential military officer in Serbia. Colonel Apis was an ideologue with ambitions for a greater Serbia, something Hartwig and Artamanov were able to harness and use for their own goals, chiefly to antagonize Austria-Hungary. Apis had been promoted to Chief of Intelligence in 1913 with the approval of Hartwig and funded from Russia. Together with Artamanov, these three individuals colluded and secured a commitment from Russia to protect Serbia in the event of an Austrian attack, which they were tirelessly conspiring to make happen. The opportunity presented itself in March of 1914, when it was announced that the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, and heir to the Habsburg dual monarchy, would be visiting Sarajevo in June. Despite Austrian intelligence having reliable information on Serbian agitators colluding with influential Russian figures to strike the dual monarchy, the visit was to proceed as planned. Perhaps they didn't believe their enemies would be so bold as to try an assassination, given what the consequences would be. Serbia was no match for Austria-Hungary. The pawns were being maneuvered into position, all under the watchful eye of the Milner Group, which was pulling the strings from a safe distance. The mark. The next step was to identify who would pull the trigger. Fortunately for the conspirators, Bosnia was rife with political activists, such as the Young Bosnians, a group of revolutionaries with a proclivity towards Marxism. They sought not only to pull Austria out from under what they perceived as to be the boot of Austrian tyranny, but also to radically change society by challenging authority from established state institutions, such as the church and even the family unit. They wanted egalitarianism, emancipation of women, and modernism. They were the social justice warriors of that time. Although the Black Hand was for the most part opposed ideologically to the Young Bosnians, one thing they did share was a hatred for Austria and the idea of a pan-Slavic independence. Apis understood their potential and quickly used his contacts in Bosnia to begin planning the assassination. The Black Hand had a cell in Sarajevo led by Danilo Ilic, who Apis knew personally. Ilic was a close friend of Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Young Bosnians, and the would-be assassin. Therefore, Ilic was the perfect link between the two groups. Apis employed three of his trusted Serbian associates. His first was Major Tankasic, who was in charge of training on guns and explosives, and would teach the recruits guerrilla tactics and assassination. Second was Rale Malabovic, the chief undercover operative in the Serbian military intelligence, a gunrunner who would smuggle weapons and munitions across the border. The third conspirator was Milan Suganovic, who had access to the Serbian military armory and would supply the assassination team with 4 revolvers and 6 bombs. Suganovic played an important role as he was also a trusted confidant of the Serbian Prime Minister, Pasic. Although fully aware of the plot to assassinate the Austrian royal, Pasic made no attempt at preventing this or informing the Austrians. The fall guy. With all the pieces in place, the chamber was loaded and ready to fire. However, there was a bump in the road that threatened to derail the entire mission. A power struggle emerged within the Serbian government, with Apis attempting to arrange a coup to remove Pasic because of a disagreement over something minor. Although the Serbian conspirators were all aligned in their ambitions for a greater Serbia, and with full support from Hartwig, neither the French nor the Russians, chiefly President Poincaré, Izvolsky, and Sazonov, supported Apis. With the planned assassination only days away, the co-conspirators and their masters in London could not tolerate a regime change in Belgrade, which would mean a government that did not owe its existence to their money and power. Apis found himself isolated. The King of Serbia had relinquished his position, transferring his powers to Prince Alexander, who resented Apis for his unwarranted authority over the military. Apis realized the potential danger he was in and tried to regain control over the situation. Pasic was aware of the plot, and so was the Serbian cabinet, resulting in the closure of the border to known assassins, in a possible feint to make it appear the future shooting was nothing to do with them. Hartwig also knew the plan intimately, but was unaware that the Austrians had decoded correspondence between Russia and Serbia, implicating himself and others. Apis understood that he had been played by the Russians, and with the possibility of being framed and blamed for the imminent assassination, which would result in his execution, he scrambled and ordered a trusted agent to go to Sarajevo and instruct the young Bosnians to abort the mission. But it was too late. The team of assassins had already been safely smuggled across the border, and with the help of border guards, who were also Black Hand members. Together with cash and weapons supplied by Saganovic, the wheels were in motion, and there was no going back. Dead Bosnians tell no tales. Despite their training, the team of 7 young Bosnians nearly botched the assassination entirely. If it were not for poor security and a bit of luck, they would not have succeeded. The first attempt was a colossal failure, as Kabranovic, a young Bosnian, threw a bomb at the target, but somehow fumbled and missed, hitting the car behind and injuring an official. Kabranovic then jumped into the nearby river and was soon plucked out and apprehended by authorities. Amazingly, no extra security was summoned, nor was any effort made to remove the Archduke from the obvious danger. Instead, he continued to the town hall to make his speech as planned. Upon returning along the same route, Franz Ferdinand demanded to go to the hospital where the official was receiving treatment from the bomb blast. However, in a twist of fate, as the driver was reversing, they came face to face with Gavrila Princip, placing the Archduke at 0 distance. It was as if the Archduke and his wife had been handed to the assassin on a silver plate. Princip immediately shot them both with his revolver. All the assailants had been issued with cyanide in order to break the chain of responsibility leading back to the conspirators in Belgrade and beyond. Dead Bosnians tell no tales. They were to martyr themselves in an act of defiance against Austrian tyranny. However, all 7 failed in their death pact and were quickly arrested, charged, and put on trial for conspiracy to commit high treason, a crime that carried the death sentence. The Austro-Hungarian investigators quickly got to work. They knew the plot had originated in Belgrade, but what they wanted to find out was the extent to which the Serbian government was directly involved. This is where we are told that the war was inevitable, and this assassination is what caused the Great War, also known as World War I. In other words, the world has been asked to believe that a bunch of young ideologue amateurs from Bosnia who got lucky and clumsily managed to kill the Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, were responsible for unwittingly setting the world ablaze. Give me a break. War was not even on the table in July of 1914. The crisis wasn't even being discussed in the British Parliament, but rather the improvement of Anglo-German relations. The Milner Group in London still had work to do and needed to move their pieces into place. Beyond the veneer of democracy, the British Foreign Office played a masterful game of deceit, and in particular, Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary. British diplomats and ambassadors, who were all members of the Milner Group, advised that the situation was dangerous and could deteriorate rapidly. They managed to convince the Austrian Foreign Minister, Count Leopold Berchtold, that Europe understood their dilemma. Meanwhile, Poincaré, Sazonov, and Grey did absolutely nothing to reduce tensions. Grey was deliberately deceiving the Kaiser and his advisors by assuring them that Britain had no secret arrangements with France or Russia. The German ambassador to London, Prince Lichnowsky, was convinced that, quote, England wished to preserve an absolutely free hand to act according to her own judgment in the event of continental complications, end quote. He also reported that Grey said he would be willing to persuade the Russian government to adopt a more peaceful and conciliatory attitude towards Austria. This was pure deception, as Grey did the exact opposite with his ambassador in St. Petersburg, Sir George Buchanan, keeping Sazonov on track for war. With the British press and Parliament showing sympathy towards Austria and praising the improved relations between Britain and Germany, such as the successful visit of the British fleet at Kiel, this only reinforced German confidence that Britain was acting in good faith, especially when many statesmen openly criticized Russia for barring the entry of Jews even if they held British passports, meaning some of the most prominent and powerful men in the Houses of Parliament could not even go to Russia. This all played into the hands of the Milner Group perfectly. They were playing a double game of deceptive intrigue, by showing on the surface little interest in the Austro-Serbian crisis, whilst at the same time agitating for war behind closed doors with the collaborators in Paris and St. Petersburg. They had convinced the Austrians and Foreign Minister Berchtold that all of Europe, apart from Russia, had sided with them. With this in mind, Berchtold drafted a list of demands to be imposed unconditionally on Serbia, something Austria-Hungary was compelled to do lest they lose their position as a major power and appear weak, thus encouraging further acts of sedition. Vienna had to act. The British ambassador in Vienna, Sir Maurice de Bunsen, telegraphed Sir Edward Grey with a detailed account of the Austrian indictment against Serbia. De Bunsen also told Grey that Austria was convinced that Russia would not intervene on behalf of Serbia. Berchtold was unaware that his note had already reached London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, and thus delayed the delivery to Belgrade until after Poincaré had concluded his visit to St. Petersburg, believing that doing so would reduce the chances of a Franco-Russian plot against Austria by rejecting the note. Compliant historians have described this visit as ceremonial with no relevance. If that were the case, why did the French not wait until after the crisis had settled, rather than during the feud? This was no coincidence. The French had a mutual defense treaty with Russia, and thus they knew the implications of Austria invading Serbia, and the response from Russia, which would in turn pull the French into a major war. This was no innocent state visit. This was Izvolsky, Poincaré, Sazonov, and Paleolog all making final preparations and reassurances that both countries would honor their agreement. However, Berchtold's delay gave the Milner Group extra time to prepare an orchestrated response. The note went from a list of demands to an ultimatum, as the wording was manipulated as the three Entente governments conspired and lured Berchtold down the garden path. He had been repeatedly told that Britain would not intervene, and, with Sir Grey's apparent lack of interest in the crisis, Berchtold was a victim of cruel deception. London had also disingenuously reassured Berlin of their good faith, knowing full well that they were also dragging Germany into a war. Keeping Russia committed was of paramount importance. Without the vast Russian armies, war with Germany was out of the question. The Milner Group, kept their agents on the ground in St. Petersburg in order to keep the Tsar and Sazonov satisfied that they were making the right choice and that Austria was backing them into a corner with malevolent Germany behind Vienna. Paleolog and Buchanan, the French and British ambassadors to St. Petersburg, were there to embolden Sazonov, whom they knew would make the defense of Serbia an issue of national pride for Russia, which had an obligation to support a fellow Orthodox nation. However, this was a cleverly played ruse, as the real reason Sazonov was so intent on keeping to this reckless plan was the irresistible prize of Constantinople promised by Gray. Poincaré had convinced the Russians that Germany was the real enemy and that France would join Russia in a war that would defeat their common enemy. With all the alliances and agreements solidified, the trap was set. All that remained was to lure the Austrians. Russia would come to Serbia's rescue, and Franco-Russian commitment was solid. Baron von Gieslingen, the Austro-Hungarian minister in Belgrade, handed the note to the Serbian government at 6 p.m. on Thursday, the 23rd of July. There were 10 demands that had been leaked over the preceding weeks, and as far as Berchtold was aware, would be acceptable in the courts of Europe. A 48-hour deadline was set for an unequivocal acceptance of every point. The note was non-negotiable. Every demand was already known to the agents of the Milner Group, including the timescale for a reply. The mask is removed. Britain, France, and Russia all coordinated an orchestrated overreaction, which was completely at odds with previous statements showing support for Austria. The dual monarchy was accused of abusing the situation and trying to provoke a war with Serbia. Rather than calling for justice, the Entente diplomats were claiming Vienna had no evidence of Serbian complicity, and thus the demands were unreasonable and threatened Serbian sovereignty, especially the demand for Austrian police to be present in Serbia to oversee the trials. Berchtold had been caught completely off guard as he fell for the lies. Many British newspapers, however, ran headlines that sided with Austria's demands, claiming that they were perfectly reasonable. Gray met with the Austrian ambassador to Britain, Count Mensdorff, and while praising the note, he still insisted that it was not of concern in London. This was, of course, another lie. What came next was the reply from Belgrade, in what had been described as a masterstroke of international diplomacy by all interested parties, even Berchtold himself. In actual fact, the reply was the work of Gray, Sazonov, and their French counterparts. Of all the diplomatic ruses before the war began, there was no cleverer subterfuge than the planning of the Serbian response to Austria's note. Serbia was under the guidance of the Entente powers. It was to present itself as a brave little nation that had gone above and beyond to satisfy the demands of the Austrian warmongering bully. The German Kaiser expressed his relief that war had been avoided, and that the minor disagreements in the demands could be ironed out in negotiations. The clever wordplay made it appear reasonable, but it was designed to be rejected, leaving Austria with no choice but to declare war. It was not the Austrian note that made the war inevitable. It was the Serbian reply, designed to provoke the reaction for which Russia, France, and Britain were thoroughly prepared for, all of which had been maneuvered into position by the Milner Group. The Russian army had begun mobilizing on the same day the Serbian reply was being delivered to Vienna. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, ambassadors, ministers, and imperial officials continued the pretense that they sought a peaceful revolution to the Austro-Serbian crisis, buying precious time for the Russian military, which was large, cumbersome, and plagued with inefficiencies. Over 1 million men were quietly assembling across a vast empire with an underdeveloped rail and road network. This required time, but more importantly, it needed to be kept well hidden from German view. The Milner Group had to ensure Germany was seen as the aggressor in order to keep public support, which would be lost immediately should Russia be seen as the aggressor. Thus, they needed Germany to fire the first shot. It was absolutely essential that Germany be blamed for starting the war. Meanwhile, in Belgrade, confident of Russian protection, Pasic announced Serbian mobilization against Austria 3 hours before responding to the note from Vienna. Austria responded with a partial mobilization, but insisted no territorial claims were being made against Serbia, and the conflict would be localized. This was misrepresented as a threat against Russia and the reasons for Russia's mobilization, which is absurd because Sassanov had already given the order with the Tsar's approval. Another historical fiction is that the Russian mobilization was meant to be a deterrent to war. Complete nonsense. This was in fact the first act of war. All powers understood that mobilization meant signaling intent for war. The reason being is the time and coordination required to assemble such vast amounts of men and material. Bringing everything together was no simple task, with careful and precise planning needed. There was no time for bluffing. If one side failed to react and begin their own mobilization, the delay could mean defeat, therefore compelling the opposing side to activate their own war machine, lest they find themselves defenseless. Hour by hour, Russia secretly edged Europe closer to war. Austria had been completely fooled by the diplomatic machinations orchestrated in London and Paris. Berchtold was betrayed, utterly deceived, by men he thought he could trust. The Tsar had been convinced of the need for war by the French president, while the British Foreign Secretary Grey feigned little interest in the disputes in Eastern Europe. Britain and France went from showing sympathy towards Austria and approving of the note and the demands placed on Belgrade to accusing Vienna of giving Serbia an ultimatum with warmongering intentions, twisting the note out of context. Russia's belligerence towards Austria was no secret, but a war with Austria meant a war with Germany. Grey presented Britain as an honest broker for peace to the Germans for the purpose of delaying the German defensive response once they got wind of Russian troop movements along the frontier, assuring the Kaiser that peace was still possible by repeatedly stating British neutrality. The German ambassador, Prince Lichnowsky, arrived unannounced at the Foreign Office with an urgent message from Chancellor Bethmann imploring Sir Edward Grey to use his influence at St. Petersburg against any form of mobilization. No one was available to see him, and Lichnowsky had to postpone his appeal until Monday. It was an old trick, and such a simple deception, by being allegedly out of touch for the weekend. Formal diplomacy was put on hold, and the Russians were gifted 2 more valuable days to move their massive military machine. Germany advocated the eminently more sensible proposition that direct negotiations between Vienna and St. Petersburg offered the best chance of peace. Grey agreed, but Sassanov did not. Knowing full well that Austria had just declared the Serbian reply unacceptable, Sassanov said he considered it satisfactory and the basis for talks on which Russia willingly held out her hand to Austria. This was yet another of the peace proposals that Grey, Sassanov, and Poincaré knew could never be acceptable. Forewarned that any peace proposal emanating from Grey was a ruse, Poincaré and Sassanov knew how they were expected to respond. When Grey suggested a solution and Germany accepted, Poincaré and Sassanov would say no. Likewise, if Germany proposed a peace move, Grey would accept and be seen as the man of moderation, but either Poincaré or Sassanov would then reject it. War was the objective, not peace. Contrary to the history books, Germany, far from trying to start a war, was in fact the only party actively working to avoid war. Chancellor Bethmann and Lichnowsky, both urging the Austrians to negotiate with Serbia, and pleading with the British to restrain the Russians. They were the only voices of reason left. With reports of Russian and French forces mobilizing, Berlin became increasingly alarmed. Their mistake was trusting Grey and other British diplomats, thinking they were honorable men, and naively falling for their lies. Sir Grey promising Lichnowsky he would restrain Sassanov. He did not. Grey also sowed seeds of confusion that deliberately included conditions and suppositions that mixed hope with dire warnings. After the war, it transpired that many of Grey's dispatches were never even sent. It was all part of the elaborate, absurd pretense to imply that Britain was making every effort to avoid war. Sir Edward Grey, whose image has been safeguarded by historians, was the most devious and deceitful statesman in Europe, doing everything he could to present himself as a respectable diplomat, simply trying to keep the peace, whilst behind closed doors conspiring with his fellow warmongers, railroading Europe into calamity and destruction, all because of his loyalty to the Milner Group and their shared desire to destroy what they could not control or compete with, Germany. Sir Grey lied to Berlin, he lied to his cabinet colleagues, and he lied to Parliament. Even in the last days of peace, he could have averted war simply by informing Russia that Britain would not get involved, or telling Germany that Britain would remain neutral should Germany invade Belgium. He did neither. The Asquith government represented a liberal party that was by nature anti-war. Thus, winning over, or at least neutralizing the cabinet was a challenge. Asquith himself was part of the Milner Group, and was aided by a small coterie of cabinet ministers who were also loyal to the group, such as Haldane, Churchill, Lloyd George, and Sir Grey. After successfully deceiving everyone abroad, Grey still needed to convince Parliament that going to war was necessary. He did this by fabricating Belgian neutrality, effectively using this tiny country as a tripwire, because Germany would be forced to traverse Belgium in order to reach France, according to the Schlieffen Plan. The British public would not support a war if Russia appeared to be the aggressor. The Milner Group had to frame Germany, and Belgium was the key. Since Germany was being forced into a two-front war, Berlin had to rely on lightning success in the early stages, and a quick, decisive blow against the enemy. Offense was Germany's best defense. This was, however, a disadvantage in itself, because it could be easily seen by an uninformed public as an act of pure aggression, which is precisely how the Milner Group were able to exploit and sell the war to the British people. Public support for a war would turn favorable should they perceive gallant little Belgium as a victim of a contemptible Germany, violating the sovereignty of its innocent little neighbor. All Grey had to do was to convince Parliament, and by extension the British people, that Germany was the aggressor. Germany was in fact the last belligerent to mobilize, and yet we're supposed to believe that they started the war. What nonsense. The German ambassador, Portales, in St. Petersburg, asked Sassanov 3 times if the Russian government would halt mobilization, knowing that this meant war, to which he replied they would not. He then handed over Germany's declaration of war, a tactical mistake as he fell for the trap that was set. Sassanov was instructed not to issue any declaration of war as part of the conspiracy to implicate Germany as the perpetrator. Lichnowsky told Grey that Germany would respect Belgian sovereignty in exchange for a promise of British neutrality, a reasonable request. Grey never revealed this to Parliament. Instead, he ensured that every offer of peace and neutrality from Berlin was rejected or suppressed, while at the same time his cabinet colleagues were informed that he was outraged by the way in which Germany had put aside all attempts at accommodation while marching steadily to war. Grey cited a treaty with Belgium from 1839, falsely claiming that it obliged Britain to take up arms in its defense. He argued that British power would be damaged should London allow Belgium to be crushed by Germany, while diverting Parliament's attention away from Russia and Serbia, instead keeping them focused on Germany. Prior to the 29th of July, Belgium had not even been mentioned, yet it was now the focus and potential linchpin for Britain to enter into a major European war. Grey had secretly told Cambon that should German warships enter the Channel, the Royal Navy would sink them. Orders had also been given to mobilize the fleet without approval from Parliament, which had not even been informed. In effect, Grey had himself placed Britain on an irreversible course for war. Meanwhile, in Brussels, on the 3rd of August, the German ambassador handed over a sealed letter stating that Germany had received information that France was planning to attack Germany through Belgium, and therefore would be forced to enter Belgium and meet the threat head-on. It was advised that no resistance be made, and that after the war, Germany would evacuate and put right any damages. However, if the movement of German troops was opposed, Belgium would be treated as an enemy. King Alfred of Belgium sent a message to Grey informing him, to which he used his speech to Parliament as ammunition to sway the cabinet in favor of war with Germany. It was presented as a moral obligation to rescue poor little Belgium's desperate plea for help. In the small hours of Monday the 3rd of August, with the cabinet abed and blissfully ignorant of his intentions, Asquith quietly advanced all preparations for war. He wrote out the authorization for mobilization of the British Army. Lord Haldane personally delivered it to the War Office at 11 o'clock that morning, and issued the very orders that he had prepared years before when he held the office of Minister for War. The first steps had actually started 5 days earlier, but the instructions had to be made official. The Milner Group had, through its agents, authorized the general mobilization of both the British Navy and Army without the knowledge or approval of the Cabinet or Parliament. Later that morning, ministers returned yet again to Downing Street. Just before Cabinet, Asquith met privately with the Conservative leaders, Bonar Law and Lord Lansdowne. He advised them that if a critical number of Liberal ministers resigned, a coalition government would be the only way forward. He knew he could rely on their support for war, since the Conservative leaders were fellow agents of the Milner Group. In Cabinet, Asquith announced the resignations of John Burns and Lord Morley, and the junior minister, Charles Trevelyan. He asked if he should go to the king to offer his resignations, or if coalition government might be the answer. It was essentially blackmail. He knew that the waverers were extremely reluctant to bring down the Liberal government at this critical juncture in Britain's history. No further offers of resignation were tendered. The cabinet broke up in some disarray. No vote had been taken on the critical issue of Britain going to war. It was such a clever ploy. By continually seeking a consensus, Asquith wore down his cabinet critics and created the illusion of debate. Later, much later, another prime minister would substitute the myth of weapons of mass destruction for the myth of Belgian neutrality, to the same shameful purpose. Grey sent Berlin the ultimatum with a 24-hour deadline, demanding reassurances that Germany would not violate Belgian neutrality. He did this with the full knowledge that German soldiers had already crossed into Belgium, and therefore violating the demands, allowing for a declaration of war. The German leadership understood the existential threat Germany was facing, and was quite literally in a fight for its existence. The head start of Russian mobilization and French armies, already on the move, gave the Germans no option but to proceed with their own plans for war, which was taken completely on the grounds of self-defense. The choice was clear: attack or wait to be attacked and face destruction with a war on two fronts. The cabinet had not authorized the declaration of war, and Parliament had only been informed after the fact, but given no time to discuss or vote on war or neutrality. All opposition had been stifled. And so on the 4th of August, at 11 p.m., King George V signed Britain and the Empire into a war engineered by men whose names are long forgotten and would ultimately cost the lives of over 900,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers, with a further 2 million wounded, while millions of others from all across Europe would also die in a war that was planned and agitated by a cabal of evil men who simply wanted to eliminate a rival power out of jealousy and greed. To say the war was avoidable and completely unnecessary would be a colossal understatement. The time and effort it took these warmongers to start such a conflict is astonishing, and demonstrates how peace is much easier to achieve than war.